I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with a small print, and today my guest is Giulietta Talevi. As always on the show, we ask our guests to introduce themselves. So, Giulietta, who are you? Where are you in the world? What do you do? What are you interested in? Tell us.
I am in Joburg, the decaying and corrupt city of my dreams. I am the money and investing editor for the Financial Mail. I also host a couple of market shows on Stockwatch, Business Day TV. I have been a journalist since 2001 and principally interested in financial reporting, markets, listed company results, that sort of thing.
Okay, well, let's start right there. You work in the world of finance and money, and yet you still live in Johannesburg, South Africa. Why? Clearly, it's a questionable financial choice.
Well, not actually. If I had to live in Cape Town, I'd be bankrupt, and my bond repayments would probably negate any sort of pleasures in life. So I don't actually think it's that unsavvy to live in Joburg, given the huge discrepancy in property prices between ourselves and I think you're in Cape Town.
Well, I'm Joburg. So I'm part of the problem, definitely.
Oh, well, there we go. Okay, so yeah, I am anxious about what's going to happen to our rates because the city seems to be voracious and incapable of keeping its own budget under control. And I think we are the whipping boy for successively awful city administrators. And I think they're going to just squeeze this shrinking little lemon. So maybe that's a bad financial choice, but property prices in Joburg are cheap. So, and I love the city. I love it and I hate it, which is why I'm still here.
Yeah, it's the general South African condition, right? It's like many problems, but where else are you going to go? Why? Who else's problems would you prefer to have? I think that's generally the answer. That we have interesting problems, and we have problems that we can largely avoid and or solve ourselves, rather than having to defer to some faceless bureaucracy. I mean, I think about the South Africans who have emigrated to Berlin, for example, trying to navigate the headless sort of golems that run that place. And I don't think their lives are that much better than ours. But we clearly do have problems here in South Africa and in Johannesburg in particular. I did an interview with the mayor of Cape Town recently, so we don't want to talk about Cape Town today. Quite enough about them. They get spoken about all the time and they get all the attention from the tourists. So let's talk about the Johannesburg questions. You say that property prices are cheap here, but they're also declining in value. So in terms of the sort of the investability of the city, what is the thesis that you have as a money editor? Do you think we are an investable place? And if we're not, what can we do to change that? Because, of course, things don't progress, things don't get better, cities don't improve unless they have budget. Again, this is what Cape Town has. They've got budget. They've got people that move there and spend money, and their property prices are increasing, not decreasing. So how do we turn that around?
I don't know how we turn it. Well, okay, I do know how we turn it around. We vote properly and we get some decent people in charge. On the question of investability, I do think that the city of Joburg has probably been, insofar as property prices are concerned, in maybe a prolonged recession for the last decade. If you consider what has happened to nominal growth, inflation, our own property prices, rates and taxes, interest rates, and if you look at maybe some coastal towns or Cape Town, which does particularly well. But maybe you need to look at it as you would a value share on the JSE. The bad news is priced in. Yeah, exactly. So your property, my property in Parkview, is the equivalent of a JSE penny stock. Although the city of Joburg would like to think otherwise, it would like to rate me as the owner of a Richemont share rather than, I don't know, Pelgro, for example. And what I mean by that is you've probably all got the adjustment to your property valuations. And so and you had an opportunity to object to this. And that opportunity closed about a month ago. But basically, the city of Joburg put an increase of about 30%, I think, on the value of my property. I think a lot of cases you have seen sort of between 30 and 60% increases in supposed valuations. When actually the estate agent I spoke to, because I thought, okay, I'm going to do my civic duty and object to this, said, you know what, unfortunately, Giulietta, you'd be very lucky to sell your property for what you paid for it 7 years ago. And that's a sort of a catastrophic loss of value. And you know, I don't mean to sound too flippant and cavalier about penny stocks, and because one's house is generally one's castle, and generally the biggest financial investment most people make in their lives. So if you've made if you bought like we did in 2016, probably at the top of the market, you take up debt against that investment, and then you find that it's worth 30% less in 7 years, and you've had to pay all the rates and the taxes and the interest on your bond, et cetera, you could feel pretty bummed indeed. Okay, so sorry. So how do we change this? We need to get a stable government in the city, and we need to see evidence of service delivery. We need to get budgets that are, I suppose, accurate and fair. Where they don't budget for rates that they're going to take in, but then actually don't meet those rates. You need proper financial management of the city, and I think any evidence of that, I actually think would change the mood quite dramatically in Joburg, or at least I hope it would.
But how do we get stable political governance of this particular city when it is sort of in the shackles of coalition politics, which is kind of like democracy on steroids, whereby we get the lowest common denominator, quite literally, like the smallest party that gets some arbitrary character that gets to sort of take charge because no one can agree on anything better than that? How do we move past that coalition mindset in this environment? Obviously, Cape Town is a very different sort of political mix, and they vote quite differently there for various different historical reasons. But how does Joburg move past that? Because I don't certainly see within the next couple of election cycles that there's going to be a definitive winner takes all situation here. The DA has shot itself in its own foot so many times with regards to trying to win hearts and minds of really anyone outside of the Cape precinct. I don't know if there's any sort of credible alternative to miserable coalition, lowest common denominator politics for at least the next 4, probably next 8 years.
Yeah, I find it hard to disagree with you. Personally, I think people need to vote more strategically, and I've had arguments on Twitter with people on this very issue. Yeah, exactly. People say, I just can't bring myself to vote for the DA. I mean, people who, live in the Western Cape and the city of Cape Town who enjoy all the benefits of a DA-run administration. And they say, I just can't bring myself to vote for them, even though they enjoy the fruits of it.
Because I'm a good and virtuous person.
Yeah. I think you need to vote strategically, and I understand that the DA has shot itself in the foot. It has repelled a lot of urban Black voters. I think with the change of leadership from Musi Maimane to John Steenhuisen, although actually the party will say that they poll pretty highly amongst Black voters, that Helen is actually pretty popular. Which would, I suppose, come as a surprise to the white liberal Twitterati out there. So I think he would need to be
the keepers of the moral status quo. Yeah.
So I think you need to vote strategically. Maybe the smaller parties. In the next election, you have to think, okay, well, is my vote for the Patriotic Alliance going to be a vote for the Patriotic Alliance, or is it going to be a vote for instability and a party that seems to align itself to the worst instincts of the ANC or the EFF? Okay, so and unfortunately, the Patriotic Alliance took a lot of DA votes away. There's a by-election actually coming up next week, which is going to be very interesting to watch, that my colleague in the Financial Mail, Natasha Marion, writes about. It's in Ennerdale, and it's a by-election. That is kind of where the DA lost support hugely to the Patriotic Alliance, and it'll be interesting to see how they fare next week, because it would indicate whether or not the voters who voted them in agree with the path that they've taken in the last 18 months or disagree. So that'll be one to watch. So I think the coalition's instability is going to be with us, but maybe in 2024 people might be more I suppose inclined to vote for bigger parties. So maybe as alternatives to the ANC, being the DA, the IFP, Action SA. So maybe not so much the smaller party like Al Jamaa or Patriotic Alliance. There's Rise Mzansi, which is a very interesting initiative. Songezo Zibi is a quality individual. He actually used to be the editor of Business Day. I think he is fervently patriotic and very smart. And they are approaching this creation of a new party kind of from ground level. They're engaging with people. I'm on their WhatsApp group. It's very, very busy. I think they might be an option, and they might really appeal to people who felt that they gave the DA a chance and then felt that their chance was squandered. But I'm not sure if I'm that hopeful that coalitions will move out of this period of extreme instability into anything a little bit more stable and pro residents as opposed to kind of pro self-interest.
Yeah. That's the base case kind of reality that we have here. So like I've been looking at a bit of this in terms of like if you want to move forward with the sort of mess that we have right now, you kind of have to do something. So I've spoken quite a lot about the difference between sort of hedging against disaster, which South Africans, particularly of a certain sort of Twitter class, have been doing forever, like sending your children overseas to study, sending your money overseas too. But all of those things, all those sort of hedges against eventual disaster and state collapse and water running out and electricity running out and healthcare running out and all those things, it doesn't actually help any of those problems. It just accelerates all of those problems when you're actually taking your capital and investing it elsewhere, even if you're investing in Cape Town instead of here, right? All we end up doing is creating these vicious cycles because we're not able to see any sort of optimism for ourselves. And I think that's probably the problem with Joburg, with maybe the distinction between Joburg and Cape Town. And the Joburg doesn't really believe in itself, right? Like a lot of us that are here because we like the place for whatever reason, whether we like the abused wife or the captive that's sort of the captive, whatever the thing is, the place is sexy and it attracts us to it. But at the same time, we don't seem to have the sort of self-confidence to invest in ourselves, right? I mean, like the for sale signs coming up as people semi-migrate to Cape Town, that's not just a vote against the political sort of consensus forecast for the city. It's also a direct contributor to a darker future for this place. So I don't know what your thoughts are there, particularly working in the media, as to how to get people to put their optimism or their love for whatever city and community they live in into tangible action, whether that is buying a property like you did. I mean, that's a bold move, buying a property in Joburg, like that's a real stake in the ground, very, very literally. But how do you get more of that? And how do you get people to actually invest in the city that they want to live in a very literal, practical way? How do you make that a compelling argument given the actual reality around us?
Well, maybe if you already have a vested interest and then you protect that vested interest. And what I mean by that is if you look, for example, at nodes in Joburg, so you've got the Rosebank district. So I mean, for viewers of the show, if they don't know cities so well, Rosebank, it's a really lovely mixed use kind of precinct. You've got the Gautrain, you've got a lot of offices that have set up. In fact, you've seen big companies migrate out of the center of town, like Anglo American, De Beers, BP. They've all got beautiful new offices now in Rosebank. There's a lot of residential, a lot of flats that have gone up. And the Rosebank Management District is an entity that is essentially invested in and run by the big investors in the district. So, the property groups, the Redefines, the developers, and they spend money that the city should be spending on keeping the suburb looking pucker. And I think that's, so maybe you have to take a bit of extra financial strain as a company by kind of protecting your turf, by investing in not just your own building, but kind of in your area to make it look good, to make sure it's clean. I noticed Hollard actually does this. Hollard is the big insurance company. If you drive along Oxford Road, you can see like it's a wreck, because it adjoins the highway, so it's just litter and overgrown weeds and vagrants living on the embankment of the highway. And then suddenly you get to actually well before Hollard's actual office, and it's suddenly you look pristine, and Hollard kind of keeps that whole street and area around it looking good. Okay, I know that's a cosmetic fix, but
many fixes are important. I mean, like whether you're talking about how much women get paid in the workplace, or whether you're talking about property values, cosmetic values, and like keeping your curb clean, have a very tangible market value.
Yeah. So then, so if you look at Rosebank and you think, okay, well, this, it's well lit, it's clean, there's people picking up litter, it looks great, there's a nightlife, there's a buzz around, there's good transport links, I would like to live here. So you actually do encourage investment. You encourage young people and professionals to buy flats in the area. So I think that's what starts a change, is when you've got an area that is looked after, and it does require more resident participation or more investor company participation,
which seems unfair, but it's in your own interest.
That is just the situation that we find ourselves in. And so either you leave and say, well, I'm not prepared to do that, I want the city to look after me, I want to pay my taxes and not have to think about anything. Fine, okay. Or you say, actually, I like the place that I live in, this is my hood, and I am prepared to spend extra money to keep it looking good. So Parkview Residents Association, for example, I'm in Parkview, they're very active, they've got people cleaning the suburb, and you contribute to that. We live across the road from a park, my daughter goes there. I'm sorry, this is all sounding pretty parochial, but I do think these kind of community structures are very important, and maybe have become increasingly important, and people recognize that if they've got a strong residents association, strong community, they can start to uplift their own segment of the city, and maybe it builds from that point.
So again, I think in the South African context in particular, this whole sort of atomization and lack of focus on the small things that tie societies together is particularly visceral, in that we sort of live behind our high walls in very isolated communities. Like Johannesburg there's different parts of Johannesburg when it comes to that conversation. Some parts, like you said, in Parkview and Parktown and Rosebank are a bit more integrated and a bit more about that sort of part of Joburg that we all like. And that's why we live here. And that's because it is more mixed use and more mixed media. And there are more different types of people from different walks of life that get together. There's also, I think, quite important to note, there's vast swaths of Joburg, for people that aren't familiar with the city, that are basically like neo-feudal kingdoms, right? Like your Steyn cities and your Dainflun, your cities. There's no other way to describe this. This is a place where there's literally a wall and a private army that keeps those in and those out. And this is how many people across Johannesburg live. And I do think that that's to a large extent quite an important contributor to the demise the city finds itself in, the sort of atomization and separation of people into very literal social classes, that breakdown of loose ties, and that disability to enjoy all the nuances that come from living in a cosmopolitan city. I don't know what your thoughts are with regards to redeveloping those loose ties. How do you take that sort of Parkview community WhatsApp group that gets together, helps people when someone's sick or when there's a car broken down or a lost pet? There's always a lost pet on those WhatsApp groups, and that sort of sense of community. How do you scale that back into a city that has been so deliberately trying to cut itself up into little patchwork squares behind high walls of closed communities where there's us and them? And I certainly saw a lot of that when we had that whole insurrection thing in the middle of COVID that went from Durban up to Johannesburg, into the outskirts of Johannesburg, where I was living at the time, in one of those enclosed communities. And just the narrative within those sorts of WhatsApp groups compared to the WhatsApp groups of people in the sort of green side of the world where I'm living now are very, very different. And I think that having lived in both those sort of versions of Johannesburg, it's very easy to see that a very fragmented walled society is much more fragile, much more brittle. And how do we break those walls down again? I mean, South Africa has a history of walls. We have a history of passbooks. We have a dirty history of very deliberate separation. And I think the only way to fix it is by unseparating.
Yes. How do you unscramble that omelette? I have a.
Why do you scramble that omelette? It's right now the egg.
I don't know. How do you reconstitute that egg? A friend of mine calls it Bangbroekfontein, Steyn City, and so no disrespect to Carolyn Steyn and Doe Steyn and their, as you say, their neo-feudal system.
So it's a great harbinger of the future of the general weird Western project, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's curious, and their property prices haven't declined to the extent that they have in parts of the actual city, because I suppose we do like control. We like to be in a controlled and predictable environment, and you have both those factors present in Waterfall City or Steyn City, or these big, or I suppose in Cape Town, or I mean not Cape Town, the Cape, you have the equivalent like Val de Vie or any of these big estates that have sprung up, where
like the whole of Stellenbosch.
Yeah, you control your electricity supply. You can provide your own services. You probably got your own schools. I think Midstream, for example, has its own hospital. So you don't really ever need to leave, but then you do need to leave. You've got to interact with some other people. You've got to, I don't know, go to a conference, and you drive through, and you're probably a stranger to what has kind of become of the city that you left when you joined your feudal enclave. I don't actually know what the answer to that is, because you've already had that investment. So, once you've made the investment to move into a place like that, you're not going to move back, and you're going to protect that investment. I guess it requires a broader increase in wealth in the middle class. So people moving up in the world. But that requires economic growth. I think if there's any evidence of any sort of sustained recovery in the city, sustained spend on services, and an actual visible improvement in the life that you lead within a metro area, then it makes you more confident. And that is actually what is cruelly lacking in South Africa. It's not so much money as confidence. I mean, you can see in the business confidence indices that come out regularly, they are shockingly low. And when you're not confident, you don't invest, you don't spend money on big ticket items because you're skittish. Yeah, and you think, well, am I going to leave in a couple of years? Am I going to be forced to leave? Is someone going to take my stuff from me? Is NHI going to come into being? So you were reluctant to spend, you're reluctant to stake your claim and put down roots. Bronwyn, I don't know. I mean, you need, I suppose, I think you need to work on transport networks in and out of cities. I think you need to make, I think that's one way to make a city kind of functional to its residents. I think you've got to have very good, safe transport networks, like trains. Remember, we had those once upon a time. I think those are the things that to ferry people in and out of a city, to address, the spatial situation that we ended up with as a result of apartheid. These people, black citizens relegated to the outskirts, kind of the whites getting all the best areas, the best juicy areas in the center. I think if you had to invest in your transport networks, I think if you had to invest in a feeling of safety, feeling that you were safe in your wider city, I think, cleanliness, so litter, refuse collection, it's kind of good municipal waste management is kind of fundamental to making you feel better about the area in which you live. I mean, these are all basic, so it's not a big ask, but it is a big ask, because it requires a change in will and mindset to serve the city and to serve the residents, and to have it requires a vision about what you want your city to be, instead of kind of letting it disintegrate into these enclaves and little functioning pockets, but without a sense of the whole.
But I suppose fear seems to be more contagious than confidence, in that it does seem to be like a sort of one-way sort of trajectory towards entropy behind more and more high-walled enclaves, as opposed to the other way around. How does one sort of reverse that flow? And is there a way to make confidence as mimetic or as contagious as fear is? It seems to require a lot more momentum. How much momentum would we require from, as you mentioned, companies like Hollard that are investing in the environment around them? What sort of example would we need to see to reverse that cycle? Because we are human beings. Human beings are, we evolved from apes. We still act like, herd animals. We do tend to follow whatever leaning there is, Chicken Little saying the sky is falling, we all like buy into the sky is falling narrative, and then we run the next direction. What sort of impetus and what sorts of catalyst would they need to be to reverse that cycle, to sort of change that gear into a pattern of confidence? So people are afraid not of losing, but are afraid of sort of missing out on the next wave of change, because that's what economic cycles do. I mean, this. You work in the world of money, where we do tend to have these, still very biblical, not to scare anyone off this program, but these sort of 7-year cycles of abundance and decline that seem to be a global human phenomena. How do you get that, shift that fear to a fear of missing out? And what sort of things do we need to see? We've spoken about this on this show too, in terms of politics. Like sometimes it just takes one good public tarring and feathering, or public lynching, or sort of metaphorical guillotining of a couple of bad guys to sort of change the narrative in terms of tolerating bad politics, decline, corruption, moral decay, to saying, actually, no, we're not doing this anymore. So what sort of things do we need to see in terms of investment in the world of money to get people onto the FOMO bandwagon? So would it be a building of a new building? That doesn't seem to work. I mean, like the Leonardo, Michelangelo sad monuments to human hubris. What sort of public displays of optimism do you think would change people around? And this is why people move to Cape Town. People move to Cape Town because other people are moving to Cape Town. How do you sort of change that back? Is it a particular voice? Is it celebrities? Do we need influencers? Do we need corporations to invest in some big shiny thing that isn't another sort of feudal enclave, but is actually instead a shopping center or a school or something? What sort of have you actually seen in your work as a journalist, how sort of economic optimism can swing around based on certain projects, certain investments, certain momentums, and that those are things we could get behind? I've just been thinking about this question. I don't have a clear answer myself.
Yeah.
But I've seen somewhere in the world where optimism has shifted.
Well, okay. So, in fact, in our last cover story, which was on the Auditor General, we looked at a town in the municipality in the Eastern Cape that deals with Butterworth. Now, Butterworth has been for a very long time a complete basket case of a city. It's one of the worst performing municipalities in the country is the Amatole municipality in the Eastern Cape that spends a staggering amount of money on employees and nothing really on services. And we profiled this particular municipality because it got a new municipal manager. And it turned itself around. It went from having, audits that were qualified audits to having a clean audit in about 5 years. And there was political commitment to do that. So they just focused on the basics. They put proper financial plans in place. They worked on their collections. They said to residents, pay your debts. If you pay a portion of your debt, we will cancel the rest of the debt. And then once people started seeing services, they were more inclined to pay their debts and pay for the services. And so it created a virtuous cycle. So if I could use that, maybe that's those little examples, and you get more of them. I mean, to some extent, I think maybe it's a bit of luck. You luck out on a really good quality person, who is honest, who is ambitious, who is determined, and they turn a municipality around. Okay, so we're talking at municipal level. In terms of business leaders, maybe you need a couple more outspoken voices to say, I mean, you have Adrian Gore, which if you perpetually beat sort of a positive drum, and he's fantastic at that. And he rouses the skeptic in me, but I also really appreciate and admire him for it, because he talks about how much better off we are in the last 20 years.
Well, he certainly is. I mean,
yeah, you need more
good reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, like reasons to be optimistic. I think you need to see some of the big guns of a city, the art galleries. I mean, look at the art precincts around Rosebank. If the Everard Reed Gallery, Mark Reed is the owner of that gallery, and he does amazing things. He's, the First Thursday initiative, which seems to have diminished a bit. I guess COVID killed a lot of stuff, but where you have, I guess, a couple of movers and shakers making people come out into the city, you have public art displays that everyone is invited to make you feel kind of aware of the incredible art and culture that we are producing in our fraught and troubled times. I mean, Mark Reed always says you don't make great art in a very sort of stable, happy place like Australia. I mean, no disrespect to the Australian art community, but I really, what do they struggle with? So great artists are born out of strife and out of struggle. So if you just had a few more prominent business people, prominent artists, prominent musicians, making more of a public spectacle or a public event or a public exhibition, and making it a little bit more accessible, that would change things. For example, I have friends who live in Brixton. Brixton is it's not a rich community, but they've got an incredibly vibrant, active community, and they started what they call a festival of lights a couple of years ago. Just kind of, they've got a lot of servitudes along the city, and they kind of closed them off, and they decided to have a little, artists or kids from the neighboring communities could come and do amazing graffiti on the servitude walls. They had kind of everyone decked out, wearing, I don't know, flashing lights. It was quite quirky. And then, so that was about 2 years ago. Last year, I think there were about 1,200 people, and there were people from outside the Brixton area that came. And the whole point is that it's not a financial event. You didn't have to pay to go in there. It included, and Brixton has a lot of, it's got a very poor, it neighbors on very poor suburbs, but it was very inclusive. So you brought kind of artists, kids, people, residents of that neighborhood, to have like basically a big neighborhood street party. And I think this year it's going to be even bigger, and it will grow, and then you get a bit of municipal involvement. You get maybe JMPD officers patrolling things. So I think it's got to come from maybe a couple of prominent business people. I think it's got to come from your own neighborhoods. I think people should get together and say, like, let's do something cool for our neighborhood. Like, what can we do, to make us feel happy about living in the space that we do. I think those are the things that ramp up confidence, and then also it's tangible results of service delivery, and it is possible if you get a couple of decent people into the mix.
Yeah, which could be the draw, right? I mean, who knows? Our lowest common denominator choice of next mayor could end up being a good guy, maybe someone that never got a chance in one of the major political parties. We can be optimists about that. But in terms of that's sort of like carroty ways in order to improve optimism, get some sort of momentum going. And I like that you mentioned it's not just about the economics, also about the sort of emotion that goes with it. So it's the arts and culture and the community thing that make it more exciting. But there's also the sort of more sticky side of that. And that is, what are your thoughts? Again, as someone that does work in the financial industry and has some sort of understanding of the implications thereof, what are your thoughts around things like tax revolts? I mean, obviously, we've had a little bit of success with things like of de facto tax revolts and the likes of the e-tolls, for example, where people just sort of refuse to pay, and then eventually it sort of goes away, even if not legally, it sort of goes away in a effective manner. What are your thoughts around that? Is there any point? Is there any value, or is it going to cause more harm than good? Again, the vicious cycles that can develop. Actually withholding support very, very deliberately and publicly among those few powerful players like the Adrian Gores of the world, if they sort of got behind a tax revolt, for example, or a refusal to participate in a decaying society, or for paying for services that aren't being delivered. Do you think that would, what are your thoughts on such ideas? He floats it around, come around from time to time, every time the water dries up, the city goes out, right?
It's a tempting thought. But it's, I mean, I asked Wayne Duvenash from Outer about this. So that was the organization and doing tax abuse, which started out its life to contest e-tolls. And the reason they contested e-tolls is not because they didn't like the tax, but they argued that it was I suppose a pernicious and invalid tax, and the way it had been set up. They never said we mustn't pay for services or pay for the upgrade to our freeway system in the Gauteng region. It's just the way that was gone about was incorrect. So they challenged it on that basis. And I asked Wayne about, surely we should have businesses saying we won't hand over our taxes unless we get something back. And he said, well, they wouldn't support such a thing because you would actually create more of a catastrophic situation in society if you weren't. You would actually accelerate the decay if there weren't money to pay for the little services that we do get. But where they argue that you can is that you fight, I suppose, unjust or invalid legal directives from the government, or they thought that a tax revolt would be actually ruinous and very hard to implement. I mean, and the point is that business is quite. It must be said that big business is quite cowardly, and also big business will do what is in its interest. So they don't really like rocking the boat. They don't like sticking their heads above the parapet. They actually hate that. They like to discuss things behind closed doors and have robust and frank engagements. So if you're going to rely on big business for a tax revolt, I'm afraid you're barking up the wrong tree. I think what you're seeing now is business is getting more involved, where they're offering themselves for these work streams to try and address our electricity, our logistics crises, crime. They're putting forward skills themselves. They're saying these people could move into this work stream to address X, which government seems sort of fairly happy to accept. I think a tax revolt, it's a tempting notion, but I just think it is probably unworkable, and I don't think it's. I don't think it's the answer. No, but I think you need more vigor and more bravery from business. And business tends to back. They fall into an organization or an association, so they don't get sort of individually victimized. So that's why you have business associations, or why you have Busi Mavuso at Business Leadership South Africa taking it for the team. Busi is the voice and the face of business. She's backed by other, big top 40 companies on the JSE, but they would prefer to channel their energies through these business associations because, and we have seen it in the past, they get shot down. I'm not sure if they would get shot down as much as now. And certainly you have seen a lot more CEOs come out and say, we are risking failed status. Ralph Mapita from MTN, Astral Food CEO Chris Scutter regularly, actually, and for years has railed against the decline in services. So I think business needs to be less cowardly, more adamant in wanting to see an improvement in governance. But a tax revolt, I just can't see that happening.
Okay, now that all makes perfect sense. But now in context with, as you were saying, with the outer was a bit different, set up for the e-tolls, which was an unjust tax. implemented without proper consultation. There were a whole lot of bad reasons. It was overpriced. It was money going to foreigners, all sorts of good reasons for it. But how do we then link that in terms of a parallel to what's happening now with the NHI, which also seems to be shoehorned in just before election cycle, like in paper, if not in practice, because obviously you can make whatever promises you like, but once you've run out of other people's money to implement, these things might not necessarily be implemented in practice. But in terms of a policy, there's lots of parallels between that and the e-tolls, like this thing that's being sort of enforced upon a society that is already paying for services that it's not getting. What are your thoughts there on how to be on citizen activism, whether it's as individuals or as organizations, again, against such things, or is this something we need to accept because we live in a very unequal society and this is just one of those things that we're going to have to deal with because that's the future bends?
No, I think the NHI, it is actually incumbent on us all to, in some way, resist this. It's a the notion of sort of universal healthcare or coverage or insurance is a laudable one, but it's not quite the same as the NHS, for example. This is and the problem is that there's no actual costing on this. Okay, so you have this aim, you have this bill that actually seeks to channel all money spent on healthcare into one central fund managed by the government. I mean, that, we all know that is a recipe for disaster given government's management of anything to date. And the ability to choose your healthcare provider, the inability to do that will, I do think, will actually spark a flood of immigration from this country. And you can see it. PPS did a survey of professionals they did a couple of years ago, and a huge portion of them said they would leave if NHI were implemented. Now, so the bill has been passed through Parliament, but it's not going to be implemented anytime soon partly because it has not been costed for. No one actually knows how much it's going to cost. They've been working on figures of about 256 billion rand annually, but that's based on 2010 numbers. So these numbers are woefully out of date. The Institute for Race Relations reckons it's going to be more like 700 billion rand a year in terms of cost. And where's it going to come from? Tax increases? National Treasury has actually repeatedly said in the last few budgets that they do not wish to raise taxes on South Africans. They resisted a VAT hike. They resisted, and against a lot of expectation, they resisted hiking the marginal tax rate because they said you get to a point at which raising taxes actually has a counterintuitive and detrimental effect. You more money leaves the system and leaves the country because it's punitive. And so and National Treasury they've got to fund this. So it's the buck will stop with National Treasury. And if National Treasury is already in budgets saying we do not want to increase taxes, our South African corporate tax rate is higher than the rest of the world, we want to see it come down. I cannot see it being implemented. I mean, where is this magic money tree that you're going to shake to get the money from this? And it's deeply unrealistic to think that people who already spend a lot of money on medical aids will then spend more of that. So they'll, if you're at a certain income bracket, you will be required to, all that money that was going into your medical aid will go into the sort of National Health Fund. And then you'd probably need to spend on top of that for kind of the private services you've been used to. There's just no money in the system. And I think you will get a raft of litigation against it, actually. I think civil society groups, like OUTA, I think, bodies representing healthcare professionals, I think will challenge us in court. I think it's going to be probably wrapped up in court challenges. I'm not optimistic, or at least I hope it never sees the light of day. But unfortunately, it tells you where the thinking and the mentality and the ideology of the government is. It also begs the question, and as to why we cannot fix our current healthcare system, because that is actually
a national healthcare system. We already paid for it.
Healthcare system. It you don't have to pay for anything. It's just because it's been so chronically mismanaged. And the health ombud, when he stepped down a couple of weeks ago, gave the most scathing review. I mean, he called the CEOs of Gauteng hospitals just Mickey Mouse operators. He said, the Eastern Cape health situation was dismaying, a disaster. He said, of course, the government will blame everyone else. What did he say? Maybe apartheid, and which it is very inclined to do so at regular intervals. So if you had to fix our present healthcare system, if you had to have oncologists in KZN, if you had to run your hospitals better, do that rather. This has been consistently the argument.
Do the job you're already paid to do, guys.
Yeah, but it's worrying because it seems as if the ANC would not budge in terms of its ideology with regards to the NHI bill. I mean, you can see it. President Ramaphosa talks about it. He spoke about it, I think, last year. It's just, and I don't know if it's an electioneering tactic, but I think maybe the ANC itself is fairly delusional if it thinks that citizens of this country trust it to manage anything now. They've proved themselves such woeful administrators of public funds that I really think there's very little trust in the system that they would be able to go ahead and manage this. I'm not saying that there isn't a problem. There is a problem in the private healthcare industry too. Costs are kind of out of control. But it works. It works. It's not perfect. So actually, what you'd ideally want to see is they scrap this whole thing and you start again from the beginning, I think, and say, okay, this is flawed. We spend so much time and energy. We spend billions in pilot projects on the NHI, and they aren't working. So why aren't they working? Shall we try and start from the beginning? Which is a huge admission of defeat. But I think that is actually what we need now.
Might be necessary. But the takeaway from what you were saying there is that courts are also an option to challenge against services that are being paid for that aren't being delivered, whether that be healthcare or actually in the case of just basic municipal service delivery. There have actually been some success cases, success in inverted commas, where municipalities or residents of municipalities have clawed back service delivery from the failing to service deliver municipalities and actually just done it themselves. You get the WhatsApp group to actually run the community rather than the elected government. Like, are these things that we should be applying more, or should we be less tolerant of just general failure and mismanagement of our funds? Should we be challenging? Is that an avenue that civil society can and should be using more to claw back power where it's not being done? I mean, like, we pay the government. The government works for us. We don't work for them, or it feels quite differently in our society right now when they are failing to deliver on the jobs that we're paying them to do, which is very literally what the government does, that we pay taxes and they work for us. When they fail at their jobs, if we can't wait 4 years or 5 years to vote them out of position, should we be using the legal system more, or have we already abused it too much? Because that's also an argument we hear, that, and it's also something that comes up in Parliament quite a lot, like fighting political battles in court using the judiciary instead of using the electoral process. But if it's failing, is that something that we could look at doing more of, like taking this and challenging it legally to fix things, so whether it's NHI or whether it's water, electricity, whatever it might be, refuse?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, government likes to call it lawfare because generally they're at the receiving end of it. But government doesn't like to look at its own role in why does it incur so many legal cases against itself? So that's a sort of a blithe and dismissive a way of I suppose deflecting from its failure. But I totally think civil society, which in South Africa, unfortunately, especially I dare say amongst the kind of white middle classes, is generally very apathetic and has been for decades, needs to get its act together and needs to recognize that we have to have a role in creating the country in which we want to live. And so I know I sometimes sound like a shill for Outer. I do pay my money to Outer every month, but I genuinely think that these are the organizations that can help us. I think, it doesn't cost you a lot of money, but if you've got a decent team of researchers, people who are prepared, because it's a long, hard slog. I mean, it took them years to get e-tolls essentially undone. You're never going to do that on your own. Unless you have unlimited time and unlimited funds, you are very unlikely to be able to withstand a court challenge. So you need critical mass, and you need people who have kind of made it their jobs, their calling to do this. And so I think civil society movements are very, very important. I think they are absolutely worthy of our support, our financial support. And I think they're going to be very necessary in challenging, the break in the social, in the contract. Exactly. What it is the contract. I pay my rates and I get nothing for it. I can challenge, that is a contract that should be challenged. It's not just Outer. There are other organizations, Sakelige. I mean, I suppose it's kind of aligned to Afrikaans, I suppose, business. But I do think civil society is very important here, organized civil society. And I think that is probably the way to go, to create better conditions for all of us.
Well, that's something. Like, we need to be more or less apathetic and start supporting. If we can't organize to do it ourselves, at least support the people that are trying. I think that's a pretty good takeaway from this conversation. But thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. I want to give you the opportunity at the end here to clear up anything, if there's any loose threads you want to come back to, or any other points you want to make about being a citizen in this place that is South Africa and in this city that is Johannesburg. And otherwise, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Bronwyn. Hopefully I wasn't too incoherent. I really appreciated being on your show. I guess I fundamentally feel that South Africans can make a difference. I don't feel like you have any sort of, you can't, if you move to a country like Germany where everything already works, well, then what are you going to do? What are you going to fight against? What are you going to fight for? Okay, yes, it's kind of exhausting having to do that all the time, but it is, there's a certain electricity in having that impetus. And I think, we have the ability to force and make changes in our country. And, I hope more people stay and do that. It's very depressing when you hear about people immigrating. So for those of us who choose to stay, I think we need to, fight for what we want as a country and as a future.
Absolutely. Although I must say, I find it more depressing when people emigrate than when they actually immigrate. Like, this is also why I've got more sympathy for communists than socialists, but that's another conversation for another day. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you, if you want to be found? I mean, I always put that event in place.
Okay, well, I'm on Twitter, so I think Talevi is my handle.
I had to hide that.
You can, I don't not want to be found on Twitter. I'm on TaleviG at fm.co.za. That's my work address. I'm out there. I'm not on Facebook, and I sort of have tried to remove myself from Instagram, although that's proving a little bit tricky.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.